The day my world fell apart in the most unexpected way. Picture this. It's 2022, a peaceful spring morning in Willow Creek, a small, close-knit town where everybody knows everybody. It's the kind of place where kids still play in the street and neighbors wave at each other while mowing their lawns. A town built on trust, or so I thought. My name's Daniel, 38 years old, a husband, a father, and someone who, up until that day, considered himself pretty lucky in life. I lived in a modest 2-story house on Maple Lane with my wife, Emily, and our 6-year-old daughter, Lily. Emily and I had been married for almost 10 years. She was my rock, my best friend. The kind of person who always knew how to bring warmth to a room with her smile. Emily worked part-time as a freelance graphic designer, which gave her the flexibility to be home with Lily after school. I, on the other hand, commuted to the city every day, where I worked as an account manager for a tech firm. It wasn't glamorous, but it paid the bills and allowed us to live comfortably. Our life wasn't perfect, but it was ours, and I thought we were happy. That morning, everything seemed normal, eerily normal, in hindsight. I kissed Emily goodbye, ruffled Lily's hair, and headed off to work, just like any other day. My commute was uneventful, and by mid-morning, I was already drowning in spreadsheets and client emails. At lunch, I decided to step outside for some fresh air. That's when I saw it. A text message notification from an unknown number. It wasn't unusual for clients to reach out, but this text wasn't work-related. It was a photo, a blurry shot of Emily laughing, her arm draped around another man. Underneath the photo were 3 words. Do you know? My stomach dropped. At first, I thought it had to be a mistake. Emily had a lot of friends, and she was a naturally affectionate person. But something about the picture, the way the man looked at her, the casual intimacy between them, made my mind spiral. I texted back, "Who is this?" but got no response. The rest of the day passed in a haze. I couldn't focus on work, and by the time I got home, I was a nervous wreck. Emily greeted me with her usual cheerfulness, asking about my day, but I could barely make eye contact. I didn't confront her that night. Instead, I sat up in bed, scrolling through my phone, rereading the text over and over. A part of me didn't want to know the truth, but another part of me couldn't let it go. The next morning, I decided to dig deeper. I called in sick and spent the day trying to piece things together. First, I checked Emily's social media accounts, but everything looked normal. Pictures of Lily, a few work-related posts, and the occasional family photo. Then, I remembered that Emily had recently joined a local fitness group. She'd been going to the gym more often, saying it helped her feel more energized and less stressed. At the time, I hadn't thought much of it, but now, it felt like a clue. By lunchtime, I was still coming up empty. That's when I got another text from the same number. They're meeting today, 3 p.m., Evergreen Cafe. My heart raced as I read the message. Evergreen Cafe was a small coffee shop on the other side of town, the kind of place Emily liked to visit when she needed a break. I debated whether or not to go, telling myself I was being paranoid. But curiosity and doubt won out. At 2:45, I parked my car a block away from the cafe and walked over, my pulse pounding in my ears. I found a spot near the window where I could see inside without being noticed. At first, the cafe seemed unremarkable, just a handful of people sipping coffee and typing on laptops. Then I saw her. Emily was sitting at a corner table, laughing softly. Across from her sat the same man from the photo. He was tall, with dark hair and an easy confidence that made me feel immediately inferior. They were leaning in close, their heads almost touching. I couldn't hear what they were saying, but their body language said enough. She reached across the table and placed her hand on his arm, a gesture so intimate it made my chest tighten. I wanted to barge in, to demand answers, but I couldn't move. I felt frozen, like I was watching someone else's life fall apart. I stayed until they left, following them at a distance as they walked to the parking lot. They stopped beside his car, and to my horror, he leaned in and kissed her. It wasn't a quick, friendly kiss. It was the kind of kiss that leaves no room for doubt. I turned and walked away before they could see me, my mind reeling. Back in my car, I sat in silence, trying to process what I'd just witnessed. The woman I'd built my life with, the mother of my child, was kissing another man in broad daylight. I felt a mix of anger, betrayal, and sadness. But mostly, I felt numb. That evening, I confronted Emily. I didn't tell her about the texts, or that I'd followed her to the cafe. Instead, I simply asked, "Is there something you need to tell me?" She hesitated, her eyes darting away from mine. That hesitation was all the confirmation I needed. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. "It's not what you think," she said. But her words felt hollow. I asked her who the man was, and after a long pause, she admitted he was a friend from her gym. She insisted it was nothing serious, that they'd only met for coffee a few times. But I'd seen the kiss, and I knew she was lying. I pressed her, and eventually, the truth came out. She'd been seeing him for months. Hearing her admit it felt like a punch to the gut. I asked her why, but her answer didn't bring me any comfort. She said she'd felt lonely, that our marriage had become routine, that she missed the excitement of being wanted. Her words cut deeper than I thought possible. I didn't know what to do. Part of me wanted to yell, to throw things, to storm out and never come back. But I also thought about Lily, about how much she needed us. So, I stayed calm, at least on the surface, and told Emily we needed time to figure things out. That night, I slept on the couch, staring at the ceiling and wondering how everything had gone so wrong. I replayed every moment of our marriage, looking for signs I might have missed, clues that could have warned me, but no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't make sense of it. The next morning, I woke up to find Emily sitting at the kitchen table, her eyes red and puffy. She apologized, said she wanted to make things right, but I didn't know if that was possible. Trust, once broken, is hard to rebuild, and I wasn't sure if I even wanted to try. Emily and I spent the next few days walking on eggshells around each other. The air in the house was thick with tension, the kind you could feel just by standing still. Lily, bless her heart, was too young to understand what was going on, but even she seemed to sense that something wasn't right. Her usual bubbly energy dimmed, replaced by cautious glances and quiet questions about why Daddy was sleeping on the couch. I tried to keep things as normal as possible for Lily's sake. I still made breakfast, still helped her with homework, and still read her bedtime stories. But my mind was elsewhere. Every time I saw Emily, every time I heard her voice, all I could think about was that kiss, that betrayal. The memory clung to me like a shadow, dark and unrelenting. One evening, after Lily had gone to bed, Emily sat down across from me at the kitchen table. She looked tired, like she hadn't slept in days, and I probably didn't look much better. "We need to talk," she said softly. I nodded, though I wasn't sure I was ready to hear what she had to say. "Go ahead." She hesitated, her hands fidgeting with the edge of her sweater. "I know I hurt you," she began, her voice trembling. "And I don't expect you to forgive me overnight. But I want to fix this. I want to fix us." Her words hung in the air, heavy and uncertain. Part of me wanted to believe her, to believe that we could somehow go back to the way things were. But another part of me, the part that had seen her with him, that had felt the sting of her lies, couldn't shake the doubt. "How?" I asked, my voice sharper than I intended. "How do we fix something like this?" She flinched at my tone but didn't back down. "We go to counseling. We talk. We figure out what went wrong and how to make it right." I let out a bitter laugh. "You mean we figure out why you decided to cheat on me?" Her eyes filled with tears, but she didn't look away. "Yes," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. If that's what it takes. I stared at her, searching for some sign of sincerity, some indication that she was truly sorry. And maybe she was. But the wound was still too fresh, the pain too raw. I'll think about it, I said finally, standing up and leaving the room before the conversation could go any further. Over the next week, Emily and I barely spoke. I avoided her as much as possible, throwing myself into work and spending long hours at the office. But even there, I couldn't escape my thoughts. Every email, every phone call, every meeting felt like a distraction from the storm brewing inside me. Then, one afternoon, I got another text from the unknown number. This time, it was a short video. My hands shook as I pressed play. The footage showed Emily and the man. His name was James, I later learned, walking hand in hand through the park. They were laughing, smiling, completely at ease. The date stamp on the video was from 3 days ago. I felt like I'd been punched in the gut. She had promised to end it, had begged me for another chance. And yet here she was, still seeing him. Any hope I had of saving our marriage evaporated in that moment. It wasn't just the cheating, it was the lies, the disrespect, the complete disregard for the promises we'd made to each other. When I got home that evening, I didn't bother trying to hide my anger. "How long are you planning to keep this up?" I demanded, as soon as Emily walked into the room. She looked startled, her eyes wide with surprise. "What are you talking about?" I held up my phone, showing her the video. "This, you and James, 3 days ago." Her face went pale and for a moment she didn't say anything. Then, she let out a shaky breath. "It wasn't what it looked like," she said weakly. I laughed, but there was no humor in it. "You've got to be kidding me. How many times do you expect me to fall for that line?" She opened her mouth to respond but stopped, her shoulders sagging in defeat. "You're right," she said quietly. "I don't have an excuse." Her admission should have felt like a victory. But it didn't. It just made me feel empty. "I think you should leave," I said, my voice flat and emotionless. Her eyes filled with tears, but she didn't argue. She nodded and went upstairs to pack a bag. A part of me wanted to stop her, to tell her that we could still work things out. But I knew better. This wasn't something that could be fixed with an apology or a promise. Trust, once broken, doesn't come back so easily. The days that followed were some of the hardest of my life. I had to explain to Lily why Mommy wasn't coming home, why everything was changing. She cried, begged me to make it better, but there was nothing I could do. I felt like I had failed her, like I had failed our family. Emily moved in with her sister, and for a while we kept things civil. We arranged a schedule for Lily, splitting our time with her as evenly as possible. But every interaction with Emily was strained, filled with unspoken tension and barely concealed resentment. One day, while picking Lily up from school, I saw James for the first time. He was standing by his car, talking to Emily. He looked so casual, so self-assured, and it made my blood boil. I wanted to walk over and confront him, to demand to know what made him think he had the right to destroy my family. But I didn't. For Lily's sake, I kept my distance. Instead, I focused on moving forward. I started seeing a therapist, not because I thought it would fix everything, but because I needed someone to talk to, someone who could help me make sense of the chaos. I also started spending more time with Lily, taking her to the park, helping her with school projects, and doing everything I could to make her feel loved and secure. Through it all, I leaned on my friends and family for support. My brother, Mark, was especially helpful, offering advice and a listening ear whenever I needed it. He reminded me that I deserved better, that I had the strength to get through this. Slowly but surely, I began to rebuild my life. It wasn't easy, and there were days when the pain felt overwhelming, but I refused to let it consume me. I knew I had to keep going, not just for myself, but for Lily. If you've made it this far, Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. Have you ever faced a betrayal like this? How did you get through it? Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to my channel for more stories like this. Emily and I were now living entirely separate lives. Though we spoke occasionally for Lily's sake, any sense of connection between us was gone. The anger and hurt still lingered, but it was no longer the sharp, searing pain of those early days. Instead, it had dulled into a constant ache, a reminder of what had been lost. Then came the unexpected call. It was a Wednesday evening. I was helping Lily with her math homework when my phone buzzed on the counter. The screen lit up with Emily's name. I hesitated before answering. We had a set schedule for Lily, and it wasn't her night to call. The last thing I wanted was another argument, but something about the timing made me curious. "Hello?" I answered, trying to keep my voice neutral. "Daniel." Her voice was shaky, almost panicked. "I need to talk to you. It's important." I glanced at Lily, who was busy drawing on the edge of her worksheet. "Now's not a good time," I replied. "Can it wait?" "No," she said quickly. "It's about James." The mention of his name sent a jolt through me. I stepped into the hallway, out of earshot of Lily. "What about him?" I asked, keeping my tone steady. There was a long pause, followed by a deep sigh. "He's not who I thought he was. I made a mistake, Daniel. A big one." Her words caught me off guard. For months I had imagined her happy and carefree with James, living the life she had thrown hours away for. Hearing her admit that things weren't perfect shook me in a way I didn't expect, but I wasn't ready to offer her sympathy. "What do you want me to say, Emily? That I told you so?" "No," she said, her voice breaking. I need your help." My instinct was to hang up. After everything she had put me through, the last thing I wanted was to get involved in her problems. But then she said something that stopped me cold. "He's dangerous, Daniel." The words hung in the air, heavy with implication. My mind raced with questions, but before I could ask any of them, she continued. "I didn't see it at first. He was charming, attentive, everything I thought I wanted. But as time went on, he started to change. He's controlling, manipulative, and lately, he's been violent." I felt a chill run down my spine. As much as I despised James for what he had done, the thought of him hurting Emily was something I couldn't ignore. "Have you gone to the police?" I asked. She let out a bitter laugh. "And tell them what? That I left my husband for a man who turned out to be a monster. They won't take me seriously, Daniel. I need you." I closed my eyes, pinching the bridge of my nose. This was the last thing I wanted to deal with, but I couldn't just turn my back on her, not when Lily's mother was in danger. "What do you need me to do?" I asked reluctantly. "I just need somewhere to stay," she said, "at least until I can figure out what to do next." The idea of Emily staying at my house, our house, felt wrong on so many levels, but I couldn't say no. "Fine," I said after a long pause, "but just for a few days." "Thank you," she whispered. "I'll be there tonight." When Emily arrived, she looked nothing like the confident, put-together woman I had married. Her hair was disheveled, her face pale, and her eyes filled with a mix of fear and exhaustion. She carried a small duffel bag, the contents of which seemed to be hastily thrown together. "Where's Lily?" she asked, glancing around nervously. "She's asleep," I replied. "She doesn't know you're here." Emily nodded, her shoulders slumping with relief. "I'm sorry, Daniel," she said, her voice barely audible. "For everything." I didn't respond. Instead, I led her to the guest room and left her to settle in. As I walked back to the living room, I couldn't shake the uneasy feeling in my chest. Something about this situation felt off, but I couldn't put my finger on it. The next morning, I woke up to the sound of voices in the kitchen. I walked in to find Emily and Lily sitting at the table, eating breakfast like nothing had happened. Lily was laughing. Her face lit up with the kind of joy I hadn't seen in weeks. For a moment, I felt a pang of something. Nostalgia, maybe. But it was quickly overshadowed by the reality of our situation. "Morning," Emily said, her tone cautious. I nodded, pouring myself a cup of coffee. "Can we talk?" I asked, motioning for her to follow me into the hallway. Once we were alone, I turned to her. "What's your plan, Emily? You can't stay here forever." "I know," she said quickly. "I just need a few days to figure things out. Maybe find a new place, get a restraining order. Something." Her words were earnest, but I couldn't help but feel skeptical. "And what happens if he comes looking for you? For Lily?" Emily's face fell. "He doesn't know I'm here." I was careful. I wasn't convinced, but I didn't push the issue. "Fine," I said. "But if he shows up, I'm calling the police." Over the next few days, Emily did her best to keep a low profile. She avoided leaving the house, spent most of her time in the guest room, and only came out to spend time with Lily. But despite her efforts, I couldn't shake the feeling that James was lurking somewhere nearby, waiting for the right moment to strike. My fears were confirmed one evening when I heard a knock at the door. It was firm, insistent, and immediately set my nerves on edge. I looked through the peephole and felt my stomach drop. James was standing on the porch, his expression cold and unreadable. "Daniel, open the door," he called out. "I know she's in there." My heart raced as I turned to Emily, who had appeared in the hallway, her face ashen. "Go upstairs," I whispered. "Now." She hesitated, but eventually nodded, disappearing up the stairs. I took a deep breath and opened the door, stepping outside to face James. "What do you want?" I asked, keeping my voice calm but firm. "I want to talk to Emily," he said, his tone deceptively casual. "She's not answering my calls." "She doesn't want to talk to you," I replied. "You need to leave." His eyes narrowed, and for a moment, I thought he might try to force his way inside, but then he smirked, taking a step back. "Fine," he said, "but this isn't over." As he walked away, I couldn't shake the feeling that things were about to get much worse. The night James came to the house marked a turning point. A shift from uncertainty to outright danger. It wasn't just his presence, it was the way he carried himself, the cold, calculated tone in his voice. He wasn't going to let Emily go without a fight, and I knew it. After James left, I bolted the door and double-checked all the locks on the windows. Emily came downstairs, her face pale and drawn, and asked what he had said. I told her everything, sparing no detail. "He won't stop," she whispered, her voice trembling. "He doesn't give up. He'll come back." I couldn't argue with her. James had the look of someone who was used to getting what he wanted, no matter the cost. But I wasn't about to let him endanger Lily or disrupt the fragile peace I was trying to maintain. "We'll deal with it," I said firmly. "But from now on, you don't go anywhere alone. And if he comes back, I'm calling the police." Emily nodded, but I could see the fear in her eyes. It was the first time in years I'd seen her look vulnerable, and despite everything, it stirred something in me. A flicker of the protective instinct I used to feel for her. The next day, I reached out to my brother, Mark. He was a police officer in a neighboring town, and while he couldn't officially get involved, I trusted him to give me advice. When I explained the situation, his tone turned serious. "You need to document everything," he said. "Texts, calls, visits, keep a record, and if he shows up again, don't hesitate to call 911. This guy sounds like trouble." Mark's words validated the unease I'd been feeling, but they also brought a sense of clarity. This wasn't just about Emily and James anymore. It was about keeping my family safe. Later that evening, I noticed Emily pacing in the living room, her phone clutched tightly in her hand. She was visibly anxious, and I could tell she was debating whether to share something with me. "What's going on?" I asked, keeping my tone calm. She hesitated before handing me her phone. On the screen was a string of text messages from James. They ranged from pleading to angry, with phrases like, "You can't hide from me forever," and "We belong together." My jaw tightened as I scrolled through the messages. "Why didn't you show me this earlier?" I asked. "I didn't want to make things worse," she admitted. "I thought if I ignored him, he'd give up." "Well, ignoring him isn't working," I said, my frustration slipping through. "We need to go to the police." Emily looked down, wringing her hands. "I'm scared, Daniel. What if he gets angrier?" "He's already angry," I said firmly. "But we can't let him control you, or us. This ends now." The following morning, I drove Emily to the local police station. She was hesitant, her hands trembling as she filled out the paperwork for a restraining order. But once the process was underway, I could see a small glimmer of relief in her eyes. When we returned home, I installed new security cameras and made sure all the doors and windows were secure. Lily noticed the changes, of course, and asked why we suddenly needed cameras. I told her it was to keep the house safe, avoiding any mention of James or the real reason behind my actions. For a few days, things were quiet. Emily stayed inside, spending most of her time with Lily, and I began to think that maybe James had finally backed off. But then came the night that changed everything. It was just past midnight when I woke to the sound of breaking glass. My heart leapt into my throat as I grabbed the baseball bat I kept by the bed and rushed downstairs. The living room window was shattered, shards of glass glinting on the floor. Emily stood frozen in the hallway, clutching Lily to her chest. "Take her upstairs," I whispered, motioning toward the stairs. "Lock the door." Emily didn't argue. She carried Lily upstairs, her footsteps quick and frantic. I turned back toward the living room, gripping the bat tightly as I scanned the darkness for any sign of movement. "Daniel!" a voice called out, low and menacing. "Come on out, let's talk." It was James. My pulse pounded as I stepped toward the broken window. He was standing just outside, illuminated by the faint glow of the porch light. His hands were stuffed in his pockets, and he wore a smug grin that made my blood boil. "You need to leave," I said, my voice steady despite the fear coursing through me. "Not until I see Emily," he replied, taking a step closer. "She belongs with me, not you." "She doesn't belong to anyone," I shot back. "And if you don't leave right now, I'm calling the police." James laughed, a low, sinister sound that sent chills down my spine. "Go ahead," he said. "By the time they get here, I'll be gone." I didn't wait to see if he was bluffing. I stepped back into the hallway and dialed 911, explaining the situation in as much detail as I could. The dispatcher assured me that officers were on their way, but every second felt like an eternity. James continued to taunt me from outside, his voice growing louder and more aggressive. He banged on the door, demanding to be let in, and for a moment, I worried he might try to force his way inside. When I heard the sound of sirens in the distance, I felt a wave of relief. James must have heard them too, because he turned and bolted, disappearing into the night. The officers arrived moments later, taking my statement and examining the damage. They assured me they would do everything they could to locate James, but their words felt hollow. I knew this wasn't over. That night, as I sat in the kitchen with Emily, the weight of everything hit me. Our lives had been turned upside down, and there was no going back to the way things were. But one thing was clear. I wasn't going to let James win. "Whatever happens," I told Emily, "we're going to get through this, together." For the first time in months, she looked at me with genuine gratitude. "Thank you," she said softly, "for everything." The road ahead was still uncertain, but I knew one thing for sure. I would do whatever it took to protect my family. The night James shattered our window left an indelible mark on all of us. Even Lily, who thankfully didn't see him, seemed to sense the lingering fear. I caught her glancing at the windows more often, her usually carefree demeanor subdued. Emily, on the other hand, seemed stuck in a loop of guilt and paranoia. Every sound outside, every unexpected knock at the door, sent her into a quiet panic. But I couldn't afford to panic. My focus was on strengthening our defenses. I added more security cameras around the house, reinforced the locks on the doors and windows, and even installed motion sensor lights along the perimeter. Mark visited the next day, offering both advice and a much-needed sense of reassurance. Having someone like him in our corner made me feel a little less vulnerable. Still, I knew none of these measures could stop James if he was determined. His persistence wasn't just a sign of obsession, it was a warning that things were about to escalate. The days that followed were a strange mix of tense calm and quiet dread. The restraining order came through quickly, but James was nowhere to be found. The police increased their patrols in the area, and while their presence was reassuring, it didn't erase the nagging feeling that James was watching, waiting for his next move. And then it came. It was a Friday evening, just after dinner. Lily was upstairs playing, and Emily and I were sitting in the living room, trying to distract ourselves with a movie. The quiet was shattered by the shrill sound of the security alarm. My heart leapt as I grabbed the remote to check the live feed from the cameras. There he was, James, standing in our driveway, staring directly into one of the cameras. He didn't look angry or unhinged. He looked calm, calculated. He raised a hand, almost as if waving, before turning and walking out of frame. I called the police immediately, my voice shaking as I explained what had happened. Emily stood frozen beside me, her face pale as she clutched Lily's favorite stuffed animal to her chest. "Why is he doing this?" she whispered, tears welling in her eyes. "What does he want?" I didn't have an answer, but I knew one thing for sure. This was no longer just about Emily. James was playing a game, and he wanted us to know that he was in control. When the police arrived, they searched the area but found no sign of him. They reviewed the footage, noting his behavior and confirming that he had violated the restraining order. While they promised to keep an eye out for him, their assurances felt hollow. James had already proven he wasn't afraid of consequences. That night, sleep was out of the question. Emily stayed in Lily's room, keeping watch over her as she slept, while I sat in the living room, clutching the baseball bat like it was the only thing keeping us safe. Every creak, every rustle of leaves outside, sent my nerves into overdrive. By morning, I knew we couldn't keep living like this. "We need to leave," I told Emily over coffee. "At least for a little while. Somewhere he can't find us." Emily nodded, her exhaustion evident in the dark circles under her eyes. "Where would we go?" she asked. "He knows everything about us." "Mark has a cabin up north," I said. "It's secluded off the grid. We can stay there until the police catch him." Emily hesitated, her gaze drifting toward the stairs where Lily was playing. "Do you think it's safe?" "It's safer than staying here," I replied. "We'll pack what we need and leave tonight." The drive to the cabin was long and tense. I kept glancing in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see James following us. Emily kept Lily entertained with stories and games, trying to keep her unaware of the gravity of the situation. By the time we arrived, the sun was setting, casting the cabin in a warm golden light that felt almost out of place given our circumstances. The cabin was small but comfortable, surrounded by dense woods that made it feel like we were the only people in the world. Mark had stocked it with essentials, and there was a landline for emergencies. For the first time in days, I felt a glimmer of hope. Maybe this would be enough to keep James at bay. For a few days, it seemed to work. We fell into a routine, cooking meals together, playing board games with Lily, and taking short walks through the woods. Emily even started to relax, her laughter returning in small bursts that reminded me of the woman I had fallen in love with all those years ago. But the peace didn't last. It was the middle of the night when I woke to the sound of footsteps outside. At first, I thought I was imagining it, my mind playing tricks on me in the quiet darkness. But then I heard it again, a slow, deliberate crunch of leaves. I grabbed the baseball bat and crept to the window, peering out into the moonlit woods. My heart sank as I spotted a figure moving between the trees. It was James. I rushed to Emily's room, shaking her awake. "He's here," I whispered urgently. "Take Lily and hide, now." Her eyes widened in fear, but she didn't hesitate. She grabbed Lily and disappeared into the small crawl space beneath the cabin, while I locked the doors and dialed 911. My hands trembled as I explained the situation to the dispatcher, who assured me that officers were on their way. The next few minutes felt like an eternity. James circled the cabin, his shadow flickering through the windows as he tried the doors and peered inside. I stood in the center of the living room, gripping the bat so tightly my knuckles turned white. My mind raced with possible outcomes, none of them good. And then, everything went quiet. The silence was almost worse than the noise. I strained to hear any sign of movement, but there was nothing. No footsteps, no rustling, nothing. My pulse thundered in my ears as I crept toward the window, hoping to catch a glimpse of where he had gone. That's when the power went out. The cabin was plunged into darkness, and I froze, my breath catching in my throat. The faint glow of the moon was the only source of light, casting eerie shadows across the room. I heard a creak behind me and spun around, raising the bat instinctively. James stood in the doorway, his expression cold and unyielding. "You should have stayed out of this, Daniel," he said, his voice low and menacing. I didn't reply. There was nothing left to say. This was it. The moment everything had been building toward. With a deep breath, I tightened my grip on the bat and prepared to defend my family. James stood in the doorway, his silhouette a menacing figure in the faint moonlight. My grip on the bat tightened, my breath shallow and fast. He took a step forward, his expression eerily calm, as if he had planned every moment leading up to this. "You've made this a lot harder than it needed to be," James said, his voice low and steady. "I just want Emily. This doesn't have to end badly for you." My mind raced. Behind me, Emily and Lily were hidden in the crawl space, probably holding their breath. There was no room for error. James wasn't here to negotiate. He was here to assert control, to prove that he couldn't be stopped. "You're not taking another step," I said, my voice firm despite the fear clawing at me. James tilted his head, smirking. "And what are you going to do about it, Daniel? Swing that bat at me? You're not that guy." His words stung, but I didn't waver. I had spent months feeling powerless, watching as he disrupted my family's life. But tonight, I wasn't going to back down. "I'm not letting you hurt my family," I said, stepping forward. The bat felt heavier in my hands, but I kept it raised, ready to strike if he came closer. James chuckled, a cold, humorless sound. "You think you're a hero? You think you can protect her from me?" He took another step, his gaze unwavering. "You have no idea who you're dealing with." Before I could respond, the sound of approaching sirens pierced the silence. The flashing red and blue lights illuminated the woods outside, casting shadows that danced across the cabin walls. James's smirk faltered for the first time, replaced by a flicker of uncertainty. "You called the cops," he muttered, his tone laced with disdain. I didn't answer. Instead, I held my ground, watching as the lights grew brighter, the sirens louder. James's eyes darted toward the window, then back to me. For a moment I thought he might lunge at me, but instead, he stepped back into the shadows. "This isn't over," he said, his voice low and threatening. And just like that, he was gone. The officers arrived moments later, their flashlights cutting through the darkness as they searched the area. I lowered the bat, my hands trembling as the adrenaline began to wear off. Emily emerged from the crawl space, clutching Lily tightly to her chest. The relief in her eyes mirrored my own, but there was still an underlying fear that James wasn't finished with us. One of the officers approached me, his expression serious. "We'll do a full sweep of the area," he said. "But you need to stay alert. This guy's not going to give up easily." I nodded, my mind racing with a mix of gratitude and lingering anxiety. The police presence was reassuring, but I knew it was only a temporary solution. James was determined, and that made him dangerous. That night, I barely slept. Every noise outside sent my heart racing, and I found myself constantly checking the windows and doors. Emily stayed with Lily, her protective instincts in overdrive. We were safe for now, but the threat of James loomed like a dark cloud, suffocating any sense of peace. The next morning, Mark called to check on us. When I told him what had happened, his tone grew serious. "You need to be ready for anything," he said. "Guys like James don't just walk away. He's going to come back, and when he does, you need to be prepared." Mark's words stuck with me. As much as I wanted to believe the police would catch James before he could strike again, I couldn't take that chance. I spent the day reinforcing the cabin's defenses, adding additional locks and fortifying the crawl space where Emily and Lily could hide. It wasn't much, but it gave me a small sense of control in a situation that felt increasingly unpredictable. Days turned into a week, and for a while it seemed like James had disappeared. The police continued their patrols, and I stayed vigilant. But the tension in the cabin began to ease. Emily and I even started talking again, our conversations tentative but meaningful. She apologized for everything: her betrayal, her poor choices, the danger she had brought into our lives. And while forgiveness wasn't easy, I could see that she was genuinely trying to make amends. But just as we began to rebuild a fragile sense of normalcy, James struck again. It was late one evening, just after dinner. The cabin was quiet, the only sound the soft hum of the heater. I was sitting by the window, keeping watch as usual, when I noticed movement in the woods. My stomach tightened as I grabbed the bat and peered outside. There he was, standing at the edge of the trees, watching the cabin like a predator stalking its prey. My chest tightened with a mix of fear and anger. How had he found us? And what was he planning this time? I turned to Emily, who was reading to Lily in the corner. "Take her and hide," I said, my voice low but urgent. Emily didn't argue. She scooped Lily into her arms and disappeared into the crawl space. I locked the door behind them and returned to the window, my heart pounding as I watched James step closer. This time, he didn't stop at the edge of the woods. He walked straight up to the cabin, his expression cold and determined. He pounded on the door, his voice echoing through the night. "Daniel!" he called out. "Let's finish this!" I didn't respond. Instead, I dialed 911, keeping my voice low as I explained the situation to the dispatcher. They assured me that officers were on their way, but I knew it would take time for them to reach the cabin. James continued to pound on the door, his shouts growing louder and more aggressive. "You can't hide forever," he yelled. "I'm not leaving without her." My hands trembled as I held the bat, my mind racing with scenarios of what might happen if he broke through the door. But just as I prepared for the worst, the sound of sirens pierced the air once again. James froze, his head snapping toward the woods as the flashing lights appeared in the distance. For a moment, he seemed to weigh his options, but then he turned and disappeared into the shadows, just as he had before. When the police arrived, they conducted another search of the area but found no sign of him. The lead officer pulled me aside, his expression grim. "We're doing everything we can to find him," he said. "But you need to stay vigilant. He's not going to stop until we catch him." That night, as Emily and I sat in the kitchen, the weight of everything felt overwhelming. James was relentless, and no matter how many precautions we took, it felt like he was always one step ahead. "We can't keep living like this," Emily said, her voice breaking. "We need to do something." She was right. This wasn't just about surviving anymore. It was about taking back control of our lives. And as I looked at her, I realized that no matter how broken we were, we had to face this together. The realization hit me like a freight train. We couldn't keep running. Every step we took to evade James only seemed to fuel his obsession. Emily's words echoed in my mind. We need to do something. She was right. We needed a plan, one that didn't involve hiding, but instead put us in control of the situation. The next morning, I called Mark again. He had been a pillar of support through this ordeal, and I trusted him more than anyone to give me sound advice. When I explained the latest encounter with James, his response was immediate. You need to draw him out, Mark said. He's relentless because he thinks he can get away with this. We need to change the game, make him come to us on our terms. How? I asked, unsure if I was ready for what he was suggesting. We set a trap, Mark said, his voice steady and firm. But you need to be absolutely sure you're ready for this. There's no turning back once we start. Emily overheard the conversation and joined me, her expression a mix of fear and determination. We're ready, she said before I could respond. Whatever it takes. Mark worked with the local police to coordinate the plan. It was risky, but it was the only way to ensure James would be caught and stopped for good. The idea was simple. Use the cabin as bait. Emily and I would act as though we were carrying on with life as usual, while undercover officers stationed themselves in the woods nearby. The goal was to catch James in the act, with undeniable evidence that would ensure he couldn't slip through the cracks of the legal system. The days leading up to the operation were tense. Emily and I tried to keep things normal for Lily, but the weight of what we were about to do hung heavy in the air. Every time I looked at her, I saw the toll this ordeal had taken. Lines of worry etched into her face, her shoulders hunched as though bracing for the worst. Yet, beneath it all, there was a strength I hadn't seen before, a fierce determination to protect Lily and put this nightmare behind us. On the night of the operation, the cabin was eerily quiet. The officers had arrived hours earlier, their presence undetectable as they blended into the shadows of the woods. Emily and I went about our evening routine, trying to mask our nerves. Lily was already asleep, her small body curled up under a blanket in the corner of the crawl space, where Emily had insisted she stay for the night. As we sat in the living room, the tension was palpable. Emily clutched a cup of tea, her hand shaking slightly as she brought it to her lips. Do you think he'll come? She asked, her voice barely above a whisper. He'll come, I said, my voice firm. He always does. And I was right. Around midnight, the motion sensors outside the cabin lit up. My heart raced as I glanced at the monitor, where a figure moved just beyond the edge of the woods. James. He was here. Emily tensed beside me, her breathing quick and shallow. I placed a reassuring hand on her knee, though I wasn't sure if it was to calm her or myself. The plan was in motion, and there was no turning back. James approached the cabin cautiously, his movements deliberate as he circled the perimeter. He tried the doors and windows, testing for any weak points. When he reached the back door, he paused, his hand hovering over the handle. My pulse pounded in my ears as I watched him on the monitor, every muscle in my body coiled like a spring. Then, he made his move. James forced the door open with a swift kick, stepping inside with a confidence that sent a chill down my spine. He called out Emily's name, his voice low and commanding. Emily, come out. We need to talk. Emily gripped my hand tightly, her eyes wide with fear. I shook my head, silently urging her to stay quiet. The officers were ready. All we had to do was hold out a little longer. James moved through the cabin, his footsteps heavy and deliberate. When he reached the living room, he stopped, his eyes scanning the space until they landed on me. Daniel, he said, a smirk playing on his lips. Still playing the hero, I see. I stood, the bat in my hand once again. This ends tonight, James, I said, my voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through me. James took a step closer, his smirk fading into a sneer. You think you can stop me? You're nothing. You've always been nothing. The door burst open before he could take another step. Officers swarmed the room, their weapons drawn as they surrounded James. He froze, his eyes darting between them, a mix of shock and rage contorting his features. "James Carter," one of the officers said firmly. "You're under arrest." James didn't go quietly. He struggled, shouting obscenities as the officers restrained him, but it was over. The nightmare that had consumed our lives for months was finally coming to an end. As the officers escorted James out of the cabin, Emily collapsed into my arms, her body trembling as sobs racked her frame. I held her tightly, my own tears streaming down my face. It was over. We were safe. The aftermath was a blur of police reports and emotional exhaustion. James was charged with multiple offences, including stalking, breaking and entering, and violating a restraining order. The evidence against him was overwhelming, and the officers assured us he wouldn't be able to hurt us again. For the first time in months, we felt a sense of peace. It wasn't the same as before. There were scars that would take time to heal, but it was a start. Emily and I began to rebuild our relationship, taking small steps toward forgiveness and understanding. Most importantly, we focused on giving Lily the stability and love she needed to move forward. As I sat on the porch of the cabin one evening, watching the sunset over the trees, I felt a sense of gratitude. The journey had been harrowing, but it had also taught me something important. The strength of love, the resilience of family, and the power of standing together in the face of darkness. Life wasn't perfect, but it was ours, and for that, I was thankful. The cabin felt eerily quiet after the officers led James away. The adrenaline that had kept me sharp and focused now drained from my body, leaving me shaky and exhausted. Emily sat beside me on the couch, her hands still trembling as she gripped her cup of tea. Her face was pale, and I could see the weight of the past few months etched into every line and shadow. "I can't believe it's over," she said softly, her voice barely above a whisper. I nodded, though the words didn't feel quite real to me either. "It's over," I replied, as much to convince myself as to reassure her. "He's gone. He can't hurt us anymore." But as much as I wanted to believe that, the events of the night still replayed in my mind like a bad dream. James's smirk as he walked into the cabin, his menacing calm, the way he seemed so sure of his control. It was something I would never forget. Lily, thankfully, had slept through the entire ordeal, hidden safely in the crawl space. When Emily went to check on her, I took a moment to step outside, needing the cold night air to clear my head. The woods were still, save for the distant hum of police radios and the occasional crunch of leaves as officers finished their sweep of the area. I leaned against the porch railing, staring out into the dark expanse of trees. For months, James had been a shadow over our lives, a constant source of fear and uncertainty, and now, he was finally out of the picture. But the relief I felt was tempered by a deeper question. What came next? The next morning, we packed up our things and prepared to leave the cabin. The officers assured us that James was in custody and that there was no immediate threat. But the thought of staying in the same place where he had cornered us was unbearable. Emily agreed, and we decided to return to Willow Creek, to our home, to begin piecing our lives back together. The drive back was quiet, the tension between Emily and me replaced by a fragile sense of understanding. We had both been through so much, individually and as a family. And while we weren't ready to address everything that had happened, there was an unspoken agreement to move forward. When we pulled into the driveway of our house, I was struck by how normal it looked. The lawn was neatly trimmed, the flowers in the garden blooming brightly, and the familiar sight of Lily's bicycle leaning against the porch brought a pang of bittersweet nostalgia. It was as if the house had been frozen in time, waiting for us to come back. Emily stepped out of the car, taking a deep breath as she looked around. "It feels strange, doesn't it?" she said, her voice laced with a mix of relief and apprehension. I nodded. "Yeah, like we're stepping into a different life." We carried our bags inside, the familiar scent of the house wrapping around us like an old blanket. Lily ran to her room, excited to see her toys and books again, while Emily and I stood in the living room, unsure of what to do next. "I'm going to make some tea," Emily said finally, retreating to the kitchen. I watched her go, feeling a strange sense of distance between us. The events of the past months had brought us closer in some ways, but the cracks in our relationship were still there, waiting to be addressed. As I unpacked our bags, I found the stack of drawings Lily had made during our time at the cabin. They were bright and colourful, filled with images of trees, animals, and her favourite stuffed bear. But one drawing stood out, a picture of our family, holding hands under a big, sunny sky. She had drawn herself in the middle, with Emily and me on either side, smiling as if nothing bad had ever happened. I stared at the drawing for a long time, my chest tightening with emotion. For Lily, the idea of family was simple, unbreakable. But for Emily and me, it was far more complicated. I wanted to give Lily the life she deserved, but I wasn't sure if we could repair the damage that had been done. That evening, after Lily had gone to bed, Emily and I sat down to talk. It was a conversation we had both been avoiding, but it was long overdue. "I need to say this," Emily began, her voice steady but filled with emotion. "What I did, leaving you, getting involved with James, it was the biggest mistake of my life. And I know I can't undo the pain I've caused, but I want to make things right." I looked at her, searching for the right words. The anger and betrayal I had felt were still there, but they had been tempered by everything we had endured together. "It's not just about making things right," I said. "It's about trust, and that's something we have to rebuild." Emily nodded, tears glistening in her eyes. "I'm willing to do whatever it takes." We talked late into the night, laying everything out in the open. The hurt, the regret, the hope for the future. It wasn't easy, and there were moments when the weight of it all felt almost too much to bear. But by the time we went to bed, I felt a small sense of hope. It wasn't perfect, but it was a start. In the weeks that followed, life began to settle into a new rhythm. Emily started seeing a therapist, and I joined her for a few sessions to work on our relationship. It was a slow process, filled with ups and downs, but we were committed to moving forward. Lily, blissfully unaware of the full extent of what had happened, returned to her routine of school, playdates, and bedtime stories. Her laughter filled the house again, a reminder of the joy we were fighting to preserve. As for James, he remained in custody, awaiting trial for his crimes. The knowledge that he was no longer a threat brought a sense of closure, though the scars he left behind would take time to heal. One evening, as I sat on the porch watching the sunset, Emily joined me, carrying 2 cups of tea. She handed me one and sat down beside me, the silence between us comfortable. "We've come a long way," she said, her voice soft but steady. I nodded, taking a sip of tea. "Yeah, we have." The road ahead was still uncertain, but for the first time in a long time, I felt like we were heading in the right direction. Together, as the days turned into weeks, the weight of everything we had been through began to lift. It wasn't immediate, and it wasn't without effort, but slowly, life started to resemble something normal again. James was in custody, awaiting trial, and while the thought of him still lingered in the back of our minds, his absence was a relief we all desperately needed. Emily and I continued working on our relationship, taking things one day at a time. Therapy became a cornerstone for us, a safe space to confront the wounds of the past while building a foundation for the future. We didn't shy away from the hard conversations anymore, and for the first time in a long time, we felt like partners again. One evening, Emily and I sat down with Lily to explain, in the gentlest way possible, why things had been so chaotic lately. We told her that someone had been making bad choices that affected our family, but that he was gone now and couldn't hurt us anymore. Lily, in her innocent wisdom, nodded and asked if that meant we could all be happy again. It was a simple question, but it carried so much weight. And for the first time, I felt like we could honestly answer, yes. In the months that followed, the trial loomed over us, but it also became an opportunity for closure. Emily testified against James, recounting the months of manipulation and fear he had caused. It was difficult for her, but she did it with a strength I hadn't seen in her before. When the verdict came back, guilty on all counts, it was like a collective exhale for all of us. James would be behind bars for a long time, and the chapter he had tried to write in our lives was officially over. But the story didn't end with James's sentencing. In many ways, it was just the beginning of a new chapter for our family. The experience had forced us to confront not only external threats, but also the cracks in our relationship that had made us vulnerable in the first place. Emily changed in ways I hadn't anticipated. She became more open, more honest, not just with me, but with herself. She let go of the guilt and shame she had been carrying and focused on being the best version of herself for Lily and me. And I changed too. I learned to let go of the anger and resentment that had weighed me down, choosing instead to focus on rebuilding what mattered most. We started creating new routines, small rituals that brought us closer as a family. Friday movie nights became a staple, with Lily always insisting on picking the film, and Sunday mornings were reserved for pancake breakfasts in the kitchen. They were simple things, but they reminded us of what we were fighting for, each other. One afternoon, about 6 months after everything had happened, Emily and I found ourselves back at the cabin. It was the first time we had returned since that night, and walking through the door brought back a flood of memories. But instead of fear, there was a sense of gratitude. The cabin had been a place of both terror and transformation, and being there now felt like reclaiming a piece of ourselves. We spent the weekend hiking, fishing, and simply enjoying the peace of the woods. On the last evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, we sat on the porch together, watching the sky turn shades of orange and pink. "You know," Emily said, her voice soft, "I didn't think we'd ever get here." "Neither did I admitted, but we did." She reached for my hand, intertwining her fingers with mine. "Thank you, Daniel, for not giving up on me, on us." I squeezed her hand, a small smile tugging at the corners of my mouth. "We're stronger than we think." And we were, stronger, wiser, and more connected than we had been in years. It wasn't the life we had planned, but it was ours, and that was enough. As we drove back to Willow Creek the next day, I couldn't help but reflect on everything we had been through. The betrayal, the fear, the fight to protect our family. It had been a journey filled with pain and uncertainty, but it had also been a journey of growth, resilience, and rediscovery. It reminded me that even in the darkest moments, there's a path forward. You just have to find the strength to take the first step. And that's the story of how my world fell apart and came back together in the most unexpected way. Life has a way of testing us, of throwing challenges in our path when we least expect them. But if there's one thing I've learned, it's that we're capable of so much more than we think. With love, determination, and a little bit of faith, we can overcome even the toughest of storms. If you've enjoyed this story, make sure to like, share, and subscribe to my channel for more. I'll be sharing more stories like this, stories of resilience, growth, and the unexpected twists that make life so unpredictable. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.